So I just want to go ahead and kick things off. So good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for today's workshop, which is titled The Hard Questions, Opportunity Zones and Equitable Development. My name is Valerie Lee, and I'm the Director of Marketing at Opportunity Virginia, the Commonwealth's Opportunity Zone Marketplace. My guess is that many of you in the audience have heard of or worked with Opportunity Virginia since our team formed in June of last year. In fact, many of you may have been in attendance at our Launch and Summit in Charlottesville last October. This year, due to the new world we find ourselves in, we were unable to have a large in-person gathering. So instead, we're offering a series of 4 virtual workshops over the next week or so, of which this is the first. I encourage everyone in attendance to sign up for the other 3 workshops, which will discuss other Opportunity Zone topics, including operating businesses, best practices for economic developers, and affordable and workforce housing. So whether you're an OZ project sponsor, an economic developer, a community leader, or an investor, I promise that you will find some value in these events. And I will be sure to drop the link to more information in the chat shortly. I have a few items to note before I pass the mic to our moderator. First, I wanted to let everyone know that today's webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this event and the other workshops that includes links to all recorded workshops. Second, if you would like to ask our panelists a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A function and not the chat. The Q&A function can be found in the Zoom toolbar on the bottom of your screen. I believe it's next to participants and maybe polls or something like that, but it's there at the bottom of your screen. Questions submitted to the chat, just because there are so many people in attendance, will not be answered. Our moderator is going to monitor the Q&A box and address questions throughout the discussion. Please also note that all attendees have been muted. Now, I would like to introduce our fantastic lineup of panelists and our moderator. Our moderator today is Marland Buckner. Marland serves as co-founder and principal of MB Squared Solutions, a Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia-based public policy and domestic strategy firm. They provide strategic counsel that utilizes their team's diversity of experience to tailor approaches to meet the specific public policy needs of their clients and partners. Thank you, Marland. Now I'll introduce our panelists. First, we welcome Rachel Reilly, who serves as Economic Innovation Group's, or you may know them as EIG, Director of Impact Strategy. She leads the organization's work to support communities, policymakers, and investors in their efforts to catalyze sustainable growth, economic growth across the country throughout the Opportunity Zones. Thank you, Rachel. Next, we're happy to have George Ashton of Local Initiative Support Corporation, better known as LISC. George leads LISC's multidimensional effort pursuing a range of high-impact investments that create jobs, fuel small businesses, revitalize commercial areas, improve housing, expand local incomes, and make communities safer and stronger. Thank you, George. Our third panelist is Brett Theodos. Brett directs the Community Economic Development Hub at the Urban Institute, where he's a senior fellow. He's currently leading several efforts to study and inform the implementation of opportunity zones. In June, Brett and his colleagues at the Urban Institute authored an excellent report assessing the opportunity zone incentives support of equitable development so far, which inspired this very workshop. So thank you, Brett. Also with us today is my colleague, Becca Richardson. Becca is the Director of Project Development for Opportunity Virginia. Becca provides education, tools, project identification support, and capital stacking guidance for local community, business, and economic development leaders. Odds are, if you're involved in an OZ project in Virginia, you have probably met Becca. Thanks for being here, my friend. And with that, I will turn the mic over to Marland, who will get this conversation started. A reminder to the audience to please use the Q&A function to submit questions to the panel and not the chat. Take it away, Marland.
Thanks so very much, Valerie. And just a quick sound check. Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up? Yes? Great. Terrific. Well, I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. I want to thank you, Valerie, thank you, Becca, and thank Opportunity Virginia for convening this very important conversation with this extraordinary group of panelists. I'm really excited to dive into this conversation. So just by way of housekeeping, let me reiterate, I have in front of me now the Q&A box that's open. So folks that have questions, I'm going to do my very best to try to aggregate them by theme and intersperse them throughout the conversation so that we can have a really good show flow with our guests and panelists. You'll see me. I'm going to look a little bit like Captain, so sort of a combination of Captain Kirk and a game show host. I've got my chair, I've got my pad. I'm going to be kind of working it. So I thought what would be helpful for us right at the very beginning would be to really try to put this equity challenge in the context of some broader public policy history. And to that end, I'm just going to do a quick screen share, because I think it's really helpful to have folks understand where the opportunity zone legislation fits and sits over the course of the last 40 years of public policy. I'm hoping that folks can see the screen. Can one of my panelists give me a thumbs up? Can you see the screen? Great, okay. So you see here that we've got really 40 years of public policy history dealing with the challenge of people and place. So the conversation that we find ourselves in this afternoon is part of an ongoing conversation that we have had in the United States about ways in which we can drive equitable economic development and community development in places, and we're looking forward to doing that this afternoon. I see that we are looking to reconnect Brett to the play here. There's Brett. Good. Okay, we've got
internet problems. Sorry.
Terrific. Very important that we have Brett back, because as Valerie mentioned earlier, Brett led a very important report at the Urban Institute that came out in June. And I was hoping, Brett, that you might just kind of very quickly summarize some of the key challenges of the 9 issues that you flagged in that report, but some of the really critical challenges associated with opportunity zones and the equity issue that we all seek to address.
Great. Thanks, Marland. Sorry again for the internet issues, and good to see some familiar names among the folks who were able to join. So hello to everyone. What we did was a research study that was qualitative because unfortunately we still don't have the quantitative information that we need to understand this program. So that's a first description of what we did and didn't do. And also important to acknowledge, we took a look at the early phase of the program's administration and implementation. The program continues to evolve. It has evolved even in the past few months. But at the point that we looked, we found some successes and a number of challenges in specific with how the program was working to accomplish what we called equitable development or mission-based, impact-driven projects. And the key challenges relate most significantly to some of the underlying structures of the incentive, in that it is actually relatively shallow subsidy upfront in terms of what can be assured to investors. And that means it's not affecting investor behavior as much as we would want. So it's not like a low-income housing tax credit or even a new market tax credit that it's really supporting projects that would not have been done but for the incentive. It is more often to the extent that it's engaging in these equitable development projects, it's twinning with other incentives and subsidy sources, whether that be LIHTC or new market, any number of state and local or other federal sources as well. And part of the challenge is around the project sponsors in the equitable space have connecting with investors. Part of it has to do with return expectations on the part of investors. If they're looking for the mid-teens, opportunity zones are not sufficient to get projects from here to there that are really having a missional focus. Part of it has to do with exit. If you have a community asset that you produce, in 10 years, you don't want to have to buy it back for a lot more expensive of a price. And so that's where a lot of the benefit can be generated around OZs. So we found some compelling examples where projects had been able to thread the needle and produce a mission-based impact. But whether it's around small business or more deeper affordability, community assets, any number of ways, we found in interviews with over 70 individuals, a number of challenges to making the program live up to what we hoped it would be.
Okay, so I guess that then begs the question, while we understand that there are some critical challenges that you've just outlined, it sounds to me, Brett, like the story isn't necessarily all bad, frowns, and concern. While, yeah, there are problems and issues that we need to talk about, I'm really curious, and I think our audience is curious to learn, perhaps from Rachel and George, where some of these bright spots, where some of the highlights, some of the good stories might be. And I think in juxtaposing the challenges that you've laid out and potentially some of the good stories, it might give us the opportunity to highlight some policy direction change that we may want to talk about. And it may also want to help us understand better how to amplify the practices that we're seeing that are successful. So Rachel and George, why don't you dive in here and talk a little bit about some of the things that you've seen and are seeing that are bright lights.
Yeah, and before I start talking about examples, I actually would ask Brett to go over some of the highlights of the report where he talks about where opportunity zones has made a noticeable difference, because to be quite honest, it's my favorite part of the report. I'm biased, but I think it does speak to a lot of the really foundational work that's been done by Opportunity Virginia and a lot of folks on this call right now. So Brett, do you mind just talking about the top two findings that you talk about in the report?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, happy to. And we want to acknowledge those as well. We did find that opportunity zones had elicited, and in some ways I feel that COVID has not abated this, a real enthusiasm for renewed attention to development locally. And that has occurred widely across a range of actors. And what we heard and learned is that it has succeeded in pulling in actors that hadn't heretofore been in the traditional community development finance space, which has been dominated by CRA lending institutions and their partners, be they CDFIs or what have you. So that was one finding that emerged. And a second was the emergence and bubbling of these local ecosystems and networks. In this case, obviously state-oriented, but also city or county or more local-based, not neighborhood level, bigger than that, but still at a local level being relevant and the hope is being responsive to local community needs, at the very least being an intersection between potential project sponsors and also with investors. And so we haven't seen those nodes, if you will, emerge everywhere, but we have seen some compelling examples where they have emerged and are starting to bear fruit.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. Rachel, please.
About the different communities where we're seeing some good growth. Yeah, I mean, I think Virginia, a lot of the favorite stories of mine, the recent stories, are coming out of Virginia, and especially rural areas in Virginia. There's a great project or investment in a local business that was being incubated at University of Virginia Wise. It's a woman-led startup that is focused on clean tech, and they just raised $3 million through participation with an opportunity fund and other sources of capital. But the opportunity fund, called the Pearl Fund, was sort of the catalytic capital that came in to help support that business. And I will also say that the Pearl Fund puts in its term sheet the fact that they require reporting on the impact of their investment. And so they're leading the space in a number of ways. And so I think that the work that Opportunity Virginia is doing in a number of ways has really drawn attention to the state of Virginia and the different opportunities for investment in the state. But we're also seeing this across the nation. Erie, Pennsylvania, I think is, probably one of the examples we talk about a lot, just because their major employer, Erie Insurance, has really been the front runner as far as an example of how a major anchor employer can step out and make sort of like those first bets. Erie Insurance capitalized a $50 million opportunity fund, I think about a year ago, and that has since drawn the attention of a national opportunity fund called Arcturus Impact Investors to put in an additional $40 million, and then also capitalized a $10 million side fund with the help of Erie Community Foundation that is sort of a general use, general purpose fund. And the amalgamation of all of those sources of capital, I think, is going to result in high impact use of those funds. So that's sort of but-for capital throughout the city. We're seeing $1 billion in high impact pipeline down in Alabama, and just a number of other sort of really exciting initiatives, and more of a focus around how opportunity funds can be partnering with local government. Out in California, another favorite example of mine is how an opportunity fund called revitalize works with the county of San Bernardino to help capitalize a new medical office building. As localities are going to be budget constrained over the coming year or so, probably 2 years, 3 years, due to the pandemic, they're going to have to be really creative and innovative around capital improvements and financing those. And so in order to defer capital improvements or the costs associated with those, they can work with opportunity funds to do build to suit projects, put a contract on those buildings. And it's really a win-win for both, as long as there is a responsible exit strategy, as Brett mentioned, in order to receive the building at the end.
Those are interesting examples. So in particular, I'm curious about Erie and Alabama. In both of those instances, if memory serves, those were, in the case of Alabama, the state, and in the case of Erie, the jurisdiction, where there was a considerable amount of planning and preparation that went into structuring these opportunities, including but not limited to the work of Bruce Katz and his group in developing the prospectus. I guess the question, George, that Rachel's cases raise is, why aren't we seeing more of those kinds of examples?
Yeah, I think it really gets back to some of the stuff that Brett sort of alluded to. The current construct for OZs does rely heavily on yield, either during the project's operations or an exit that creates a profit for the investors. And actually, from a mathematical standpoint, the higher the yield and the more profit created in the exit, the greater the benefit, the tax benefit to the investors. So that really can be hard to find to some degree, especially in the traditional like affordable housing, which has really been the largest community investment vehicle here to date. It's not a bad thing to see the industry forced to find other ways of solving for wealth gaps and everything else. I think we've all sort of come to the realization that affordable housing is not going to be what fixes everything. So in some ways, OZ legislation is really pushing the industry to evolve beyond that, because that asset class doesn't fit well for opportunities in investing. And so to evolve into thinking more about some of the project types that Rachel mentioned, in terms of commercial projects, mixed use projects, mixed income housing, things that provide some yield and or could, be sold in 10 years responsibly and without creating a lot of displacement. And so, I think finding those is not easy. Making the case, especially now for, commercial or mixed use projects, given what's going on with the pandemic, especially is probably slowed down the pipeline a bit and being able to justify some of those activities that will again sort of reemerge as the pandemic subsides and we get back to normal. But finding those and then obviously waiting for economic activity to continue to migrate. So we're in a partnership with Blueprint Local on a fund in the Southeast that's really exciting. And they have a concept of Zoom cities, which is sort of the migration of workers and people further south. And so waiting for that economic activity to sort of migrate so that it can support some of these more creative projects is also part of what you're waiting for and justifying the investments on behalf of investors. So I think, they are hard to find, but maybe, in many ways, we are helping to make the case for democratizing or spreading out capital opportunity because we're helping to encourage that migration away from just the, city centers or the urban centers around the country, which frankly, in so many ways, this country needs anyway. So, but that can make it hard to sort of justify. But we found, some great examples. We invested in a project in Anacostia that was mixed use with minority employer, taking up a lot of the office space. The last thing I'll say is the office space market also has taken a bit of a pause with the pandemic. And so that will shrink the pipeline up for a little bit as well.
Can I say one thing about the Zoom cities, just sort of forecasting and where I think opportunity zones could be really beneficial? To have an affordability crisis, you don't have to be in a major metro. You can be a small town and have an affordability crisis if your housing stock is not up to date or is not sufficient to meet the demand of your population. And so, traveling throughout the country over the past couple of years, a lot of the communities in the heartland and in, the middle tier markets are using opportunity zones to invest in their housing stock because they know that they need a full housing stock in order to meet the needs of residents making different income levels. And they're especially going to need that to attract employers. And so as folks start to migrate out to these Zoom cities, I think that there may be an affordability crunch in these smaller communities as the housing stock, which didn't necessarily feel pinched at any point before, may feel pinched. By proactively investing in housing in those communities and using opportunity zones to do it, especially workforce housing, which has proved to be a really popular asset class amongst OZ investors, seems like a really proactive way to avoid an affordability crisis in those communities.
Well, so for folks in the audience, I promised our panelists that this was not going to be the potted plant moderator process. And so each of them, as accomplished as they are, I indicated to them that they should expect to be interrogated and provoked. And so this is the provocation part of the conversation. So I just want to push back on a couple of points here, because I have to say, we've got some upside. Yeah, this sounds good, and it sounds like we've got a decent runway to help solve some of these problems. But I'm not hearing anybody talk about deep impact here. I'm not hearing anybody talk about the challenges associated, the acute challenges associated with, for example, as we have in Richmond, Virginia, an eviction crisis because of an affordability and supply problem. I'm not hearing anybody talk about deep impact. Why?
Yeah. As LISC, I'll sort of speak to that and then pass the mic. So I think that when we talk about deep impact, we have to talk about the way the legislation is set up right now and the pressures that are being applied from either side of the ledger. So right now, a lot of the benefits, as I said before, are really pressuring the community and community development space to try to figure out what would work for these investors, given the incentives that are in front of them. We are a proponent of in increasing the requirements with respect to impact on the investors to try to push them a bit more towards the middle as well. And so that may not be everyone's position, but I think if we can add some of those requirements reporting or explicitly otherwise in terms of impact, we can start to sort of force the two communities closer together, and you might get to some affordability, and dare I say deeper affordability. I happen to believe that the only way that this is going to apply to deep affordability is in a mixed income application, because I don't think we can expect equity investors to necessarily be really excited about, 100% deeply affordable projects. And I think this space overall is sort of moving away from this concept that, a bunch of units that are all deeply affordable together is actually not a good thing. So that's what I'd say to that.
Okay, so Rachel, before you jump in, I want you, as part of your build and response to that, to help incoming HUD Secretary Theodos understand precisely what he needs to do and how he needs to do it. So in addition to what you were gonna say, please dive in on and give the Secretary some guidance. Yeah, so Secretary Theodos, Brett is mortified right now, but we're all friends, so it's fair. I think what HUD has actually done really well is that they have been doing a good job of tracking best practices and putting out those playbooks for OZs. So where this is working and trying to put out those standards so folks can replicate those things. I think, and building out that technical assistance. Right now, the career staff that's leading that effort is Eric Yost at HUD. And so during the transition, if you guys need a point of contact there, he will be more than happy to talk with you, I promise. But just to give you an example of deep impact with opportunity zones, in Columbus, Ohio, there's a project called Cargominium, and it is a 100% re-entry project. So folks exiting the incarceration system and needing a place to land upon exit. It's affordable housing for them, and it is a mixed-use project because it's both affordable housing for them as well as on the first floor, it's nonprofit space for a nonprofit that provides wraparound services for folks that were formerly incarcerated. The nonprofit is a JV partner on the deal, so they have equity stake, and at year 10, they have first right of refusal to buy out that property at exit. And so they will have the opportunity to purchase the property and ensure the long-term use remains the same. And so I think it's just taking examples like those and figuring out how to replicate them throughout the nation. This is a project that didn't include any additional subsidy. It's OZ financed with additional debt. And so it's figuring out what the magic sauce was there and just continuing to talk about it. But I agree that those examples are notable because they're not the norm. But I would also push my friends in the LITech community to think about how often they're hitting 30% AMI, how often they're hitting very low income and extremely low income residents with the low income housing tax credit. It's a challenge. And so I would just be asked to be held to the same standards, especially with a tool that was never really meant to house extremely low income and vulnerable populations. We just have to reorient around the original intent of the policy, even though we can strive to do the best we can. Secretary Theodos.
I have yet to get that call, but I'll let you know if it comes. A couple of thoughts. One is, in a way, unfortunately, it's not that special to be a zone. So there's not 87 zones. There's not even 870 zones. There's 8,700 zones. And so investors are in the driver's seat. They've got a lot of different places they can go. So there's not really a constraint, if you will, on being a zone. Sure, it's not everywhere, but it's enough places that it's not a constraint on investor choice or behavior. And then in terms of the actual subsidy itself, it's a couple hundred basis points, at least the upfront part, that is a boost, to return. And so it really is, I think if we think of it as lower priced equity, or hopefully it's lower priced if it even really gets to the project sponsor. Maybe it just gets absorbed by the investor, but if it gets to the project sponsor, it's a little bit lower priced equity. But you know, how big a piece of the capital stack is equity in the project? You know, a lot of projects we looked at, OZs were 5% of the capital stack, 10% of the capital stack. There are examples when it's 100%. But in the way commercial multifamily real estate development is often done, that's not typically the case. And so if we're talking about a little bit lower price on a part of a capital stack that is a part, you just start to see, you know, mathematically that it just doesn't add up to that much extra cash into the deal. So it's hard to get deeper impact out of it.
Is it fair to say that, Brett, is it fair to say that the argument that you've just made, just given the nature of the program and its evolution, applies principally to real estate deals, yeah?
Yes, I think the reason we're talking so much about real estate deals is business investing is in some ways even harder.
Yeah, and because I want us to pivot to that. We've had a couple of questions, some Virginia specific questions, but they open the door to the conversations that we're going to have in subsequent sessions about operating businesses. But I'm wondering if any of our panelists can speak either specifically in the case of Virginia or more broadly about either examples that have been undertaken or that where diligence has been done and studies been undertaken, but it may be an open question, especially in the areas of broadband and of clean energy, a little bit more generally, perhaps solar or wind. Anyone?
Specifically, Becca just popped on, so I'm actually going to let her go. Yeah.
Sorry, having trouble with Zoom as usual. Almost a year in. With Virginia, there's a lot of effort going into figuring out how to do this with broadband, how to use OZ money with broadband. And I think it is very possible when we think about using OZ dollars to purchase equipment that reaches the outer broadband areas. That's still a puzzle that folks I think folks are trying to put together. And with regard to sustainability projects, Virginia is in a really interesting place right now in that an increasing number of localities are passing ordinances to allow something called PACE financing, which is upfront financing for sustainability aspects of a project. And it's not just solar. There are geothermal aspects. I mean, it's a very wide range of costs that it covers. And what this type of financing allows is another layer in the overall capital stack, or the sources, if you will, of all of the types of financing that go into a project to make it happen. So I think that one thing that we all can agree is that the opportunity zone incentive is not one that is going to typically get a project done. It's not one that's going to drive a project forward. It is a team of individuals, usually quite a collaborative and large team of individuals, using many financing tools and combining them that make a project happen, especially if it's going to have deep impact. So I think that we are going to be seeing more and more projects that are sustainable, especially in Virginia, now that we are seeming to have an increase in the usage of this type of capital stack addition in PACE financing.
Some of the other challenges with solar financing in particular, or even some of the biomass, et cetera, is the term of the financing. So oftentimes tax credits and debt in the transaction are 15-year. The PPA is 15, 20 years as well. So, which brings an interesting point back to sort of some of the stuff that Brett said about how there are 8,000 OZs, right? And so lots of things to pick from. And then you combine that with like some of the constraints on actually applying OZ capital, just, you know, so it has to be equity, the term, et cetera. Then you start to, you know, figure out that while there are lots of spaces, there are fewer cases that work. So one of the thoughts is, and people, this is not my thought, but a lot of folks are talking about, can you expand what is allowable under OZ investing? Does it have to be just equity? Why can't it be debt, right? Does it have to be a 10-year? Can it be longer? Can it be shorter? And so, you know, you could shrink the number of OZs, or you could expand what qualifies to have some sort of OZ tax benefit, right? There's two different ways of supply of working through the sort of supply and demand issue.
Yeah, and I think, you know, whenever I get to the problem where we're hitting our head against the infrastructure piece of it, I start to pivot back to the, well, can you make an investment into the business that would then allow them to, again, purchase equipment or invest in infrastructure? So the investment isn't into the infrastructure that's then tied to additional sources of financing and tax credits, but it's an investment into the business, and then it's decoupled from the infrastructure investments. And I think, you know, one of the best ways to get investors comfortable with investments into businesses is having some sort of state-sponsored contract secured by that business. And so if there's a state-sponsored contract that business has secured for these types of activities, or city-sponsored, whatever it is, I think that just helps to de-risk that investment.
Yeah, the challenges with that are investing in a business is, you know, ipso facto more risky than an individual transaction. And so to Becca's point, all the rest of the capital stack is cheap because it only invests into that particular project. And to your point, like often the projects do have a creditworthy offtake for a long period of time, whether it's state or corporate or whatever. So when you try to pull that to the business level, you run into obviously just a different thought process with respect to the risk of the investment. And then to Brett's earlier point, we have all the qualifications around why businesses, what businesses have to do to be qualified as OZ businesses, right? In terms of their employees and hours worked, et cetera. So it's funny actually, now I'm thinking, you know, wow, wouldn't it be awesome if we could add some impact and then expand or loosen the criterion for what it takes to qualify, right? As a way of sort of pushing and pulling.
Yeah, you know, this I think raises a couple of questions, and I know we've talked a little bit about some of these policy challenges, and I mean, I guess just a parenthetical question would be, you know, to what degree is this going to require statutory change, or can it be handled essentially as an administrative process? And I think those, again, will leave to the secretary to manage with his team when he has that chance. I want to take us back though. To this central challenge of equity that we have as the core subject for today. And apropos of that, Rachel, I wonder if you could just name again, I believe it was the project in Columbus. You said Columbus, Ohio. What was the name of that project?
Cargominium.
Cargominium. Okay. And to what degree in that particular project were impact measures integrated from the front end, and what were they?
So I can't speak to Cargominium, but the reference point that I will share is on our website. We just did a webinar on impact evaluations and measuring, and we had NES Financial, which is a back office service provider for 100 opportunity funds and offers and framework for this, as well as Catalyst opportunity funds, and they share their proprietary screening measures for impact. So that would be the reference point. but there are opportunity funds that are out there doing that. And then also, yeah, go ahead.
Because that's helpful. I want to pick back up on a point that George, you raised just a moment ago. And I'd like Brett for you to speak to this as well. Because it feels to me, I say feels, like there may be a kind of pay for success. There may be some pay for success opportunities associated with the kinds of projects, the sort of which Rachel was describing. George, I heard you talking about credit, essentially creditworthy offtake. Does that track at all with you? And Brett, how does that fit conceptually into your view, given the breadth of view that you have on the work?
In an interesting way, the opportunity zones do have that speculative nature built in, right? I mean, the back end is speculative with how much appreciation there will be. And so that's part of the challenge of underwriting up front, is not knowing exactly what the return is going to be. But unlike in pay for success type projects, the real compensation is tied to appreciation of the asset. It's not tied to community benefit. And so I think that we would need a different structure to really prioritize impact. And that, in that way, it would require statutory change. But I would lift up that I do think the Secretary of the Treasury could institute a legitimate certification process for opportunity funds, and could have impact criteria built into the certification process. I think that's what Congress initially intended. It's certainly within the statutory right. And so I actually think there's a lot of room to shape who engages in this incentive and how, even apart from statutory change. And so I think it'd be very interesting to see what the Biden administration decides to do around certification, which could include reporting requirements as well.
Rachel, I see you nodding in agreement.
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about legislative fixes or statutory changes, but with I'm not going to say potential Biden administration, I think incoming new administration, there are a lot of things that the current administration during the regulatory process was left open to their interpretation, especially how far they could go with rulemaking around reporting and certification. And we may see a different interpretation of that with a new administration. So a lot of the things that we thought required congressional action may not, in fact, require congressional action based on interpretation of a new Treasury Secretary.
So that, I guess then that begs the question, to what degree ought folks in the audience today, and we're delighted to welcome a variety of a real cross-section of folks, including but not limited to some folks that have direct impact on policy making, even here in the state of Virginia. So I guess that begs the question, what advice would you give folks in the short run, being able to connect their experience either with deals that have gone well or with barriers that have been put up? And how might we begin to talk about some of the, I'm going to call light lift policy changes or tweaks in the program that can help us begin to address the equity challenge specifically?
Yeah, I'll say that EIG anticipates continuing to be involved throughout this process. And so throughout the reform process, please stay in touch with us. We want to hear your thoughts, your experiences. We also have an activity map where you can share with us the projects that you've engaged in. I think that that's a great way for us to collectively establish market norms and best practices to help guide what the marketplace looks like and what good actors and good stewards of the policy look like. And so we have a OZ coalition. If you're interested in joining, I can put you in touch with our coalition manager, but that's really the cohort through which we will be advancing recommendations around the reforms.
My advice would be to get creative. So some of the projects that we're looking at in the Southeast are, food markets. They are, mixed income housing and office. They are all kinds of sort of creative but defendable projects and pro formas. And I think they're out there. And I think, in terms of light changes, I would advocate expanding what qualifies and making it a bit easier. But even with what we have today, we can find a fair bit out there that makes sense and is exciting for the community, but also for investors in terms of yields, et cetera. And we're seeing some pretty big macro population movements in the country with respect to, San Francisco reporting having, first decline in population in like 40 years. And so people are moving. And when people move around a country, to one of the points that Rachel Reilly made earlier, there are opportunities that come with those sort of changes, right? And so actually, I think we're heading into a time period where there is going to be a good deal of opportunity on the business investment side, but certainly on the real estate side as well. So the last bit of advice I'd say is make sure you get the right professionals to the table early. We have seen a bunch of folks excited about a project only to find out that it obviously doesn't qualify for some well-known reason. And so the earlier you can figure that out, the less heartache you save yourself and save yourself time and money as well.
Yeah, George, I'm glad you raised the food market issue. We've actually got a question here, and I do think, at the beginning, really back in 2015, and as the legislation was moving through, I think there was always this question about the way in which opportunity zone equity could be used to drive rural development and projects in rural America. We've got a question about that. I'm wondering if George, you can, or if Rachel or Brett, say a little bit more about the rural development possibilities here, how they may be distinct, examples that you've seen where OZ equity has been put to work effectively in a more rural context.
So I keep probably saying the same thing different ways because I think the same answer applies. But when we talk to investors, when we talk to project sponsors, they all say things like, if a deal doesn't work without OZs, it doesn't work with OZs. Or if it's not a good deal, before OZs, it's not a good deal after OZs. And what I interpret that to say is, them saying that, again, the OZs themselves are not sufficient in most cases to push deals ahead that otherwise are not attractive. And so if there are rural areas, which there are, that are near ski slopes or other amenities or attractions that are growing and that are attractive to investors, then absolutely OZs can be used and will be used for those. But if they are in declining areas where populations are getting lost, Youngstown lost 20% of its population since 2000, it's hard to imagine land values appreciating. And if this is principally a real estate program based on appreciation, if land's not going up, it's hard to imagine that much appreciation emerging. So a lot of it's going to come down to the market fundamentals of the place, as well as some creativity, sophistication, awareness, ability to connect with an investor class that may or may not be familiar with communities.
I think one of the struggles that rural communities have is around new starts. And so if you haven't had anything built in your community for 15, 20 years, trying to attract private financing to get that first housing development is just really tough because there's no market comps and you can't demonstrate demand. And so where I've seen opportunity zones be successful is in order to attract that, it's an incentive to attract that sort of first in capital. And so that's where I really have a lot of, optimism around OZs in rural markets. We have a number of examples on our website of places where it's worked in rural communities, but also on the food piece, the food market piece, And going back to the market rate housing, OZs does get a lot of flack around investing in market rate housing, but in food deserts specifically, a grocery store won't move to a community unless there's a certain number of homes or residents populating that community. And so as long as you're not gentrifying folks out or displacing folks, if the population is zero, you're not getting a new grocery store until there's more people in that community, because it's financially unfeasible for a grocery store to move there. And so market rate housing in that scenario is not necessarily a bad thing if there's folks in that community that want a grocery store. So I just think it's, again, I think it's how you do it if it's done with the community, and if you're ensuring that future plans for development are inclusive ultimately.
Yeah, I'm pausing to kind of take in a lot of what folks have been, a lot of what our panelists have been saying, because, you know, this is clearly, we're clearly in a situation where 3 years into the program, it's neither feast nor famine. We have opportunities to make tweaks. We're seeing some successes, but the challenge of impact, you know, it seems like it's basically the same as it's been for, frankly, about the last 40 years, you know, as we saw on the slide from the beginning. And so I guess in kind of trying to pull some of this conversation together and help to frame subsequent discussions in the series, I think in the spirit of a lightning round, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to, and you can pause for a minute and think this through, but you've got 5 minutes with President-elect Biden. What are the 3 things he's got to do to fix OZs so that we can better situate that capital to have more impact, or deploy more of it more quickly in a more, lower the friction in transactions? Those are the 2 kind of lightning round questions that I want you to answer. And Secretary of the Treasury, Theodos, I'm sorry, I gave you HUD, I meant Treasury, you're up.
Sure, although HUD has a role too, so yeah. I'll say 2. One, to have a legitimate certification process that limits the actors to those who can plausibly demonstrate community benefit. And that absolutely, to Rachel's point, that can include market rate development. It definitely can. But having a real ability to demonstrate that and track it over time, I absolutely think reporting requirements can be built into the certification process. So that's what can be done on the administrative side. And then the other thing that I'd say is just to hold out for a good enough deal. You know, there's going to be incredible pressure to extend this program as we start approaching some of the sunset. And it is a very popular program, especially with real estate community, which is a very influential community in Congress. And so I would just say hold out on any extension to get a real benefit. You know, lop off the uses that are harmful to communities, instill some real community participation process, and amplify and double down on uses that are truly beneficial to communities, and also communities that truly need the help. We've got a range of zones, some of which are really disinvested and some of which aren't. And so I've proposed a more graduated scale where we actually go bigger in communities that really need the help. So I think there's a lot of options on the table.
Good, excellent. George, you're up.
Yeah, somewhat similar list here. So one is require more impact. And I would actually argue that it's not just in reporting. I think reporting is retroactive, and I think you're not going to shame investors into doing the right thing. So I think you have to figure out some way to sort of proactively put some guardrails on what qualifies from an OZ perspective as a impactful investment. Number two, expand what qualifies. And I mean, in terms of the types of investments, equity versus debt, but I also mean in terms of what it takes for a business or real estate investment to actually qualify for the tax benefit. And then number three is provide credit support. So if you want investors to take on more risk, obviously showing more upside and reward if things work out is great, but it doesn't necessarily protect downside. And so it doesn't have as strong of an effect as you might think on having investors take on more risk because they only get the OZ benefits if it works out. So providing some credit support would be the third thing I would mention.
Great. And before I turn it back to Valerie to close us out, I'm going to ask our incoming chair of the Senate Finance Committee, Chairwoman Reilly, to give us her couple and then gavel.
Yeah, I feel like a congressional job is thankless, so I won't be signing up for that. No, I think depoliticizing the policy, it has bipartisan support. So, and adding transparency, I think immediately depoliticizes it and encourages a broader group to engage in it. Allowing fund-to-fund structures for operating businesses, I think allows for smaller capital deployment, which I think is critical for businesses. And gosh, there was a third one, but yeah, those two I think are good for right now.
Terrific. Well, I want to thank all of our guests, Rachel, George, Brett. Really, really appreciate it. And Valerie, Becca, I'm going to turn it back to you to close this out.
All right. Thank you, Marland. Thank you so much. That was what a fantastic and engaging, informative discussion. I know we could keep talking about this for the rest of the afternoon into tomorrow and the next day. But unfortunately, we do have to cap it at an hour for today. Thank you to all of the attendees who submitted questions. We did try our best to get to most of them, but we got a lot of questions. A huge thank you to our panelists and our moderator. You all are proven leaders in this space, and Opportunity Virginia is just so very grateful for your partnership. So thank you for being here. As I mentioned at the top of the discussion, a follow-up email is going to be sent to everyone who registered for this event next week, and it'll include a link to the recording of this webinar and our other webinars that we're doing as part of this series. There'll be some other resources in that email as well. In the meantime, if you would like to contact our team at Opportunity Virginia or learn about Virginia's opportunity zones, or register for the other workshops in this series, please visit our website, opportunityva.org. And with that, I will conclude our webinar. Thanks again to everyone who has joined us today, and we'll talk to you soon, I'm sure.